This video is a brief overview of the writing process and some ideas you should consider as you begin approaching your major assignments throughout the course, as well as the writing you'll do outside of the class. So what is the writing process? First of all, the writing process should be seen as recursive, and this means that while there are stages, it doesn't mean that you follow each one in a linear way. You don't always start with pre-writing, move to drafting, and then conclude with revision, and then be done. Often you'll cycle through these different stages in a number of different ways. So the different stages, as I differentiate them, are pre-writing, drafting, and revision, and we'll explore each one in a little more detail. First, pre-writing. This is often what's referred to as brainstorming, and there's a lot of different ways that you can go about brainstorming ideas for the writing that you do. In your Essentials of Technical Communication book, Tabo and Draga actually list 3 separate steps under this phase, or this stage. They list analyzing the situation, choosing or discovering content, and arranging the content. And essentially this is figuring out what needs to be said, figuring out how to or what to say, and then arranging it in a way that works the best. So outlining or organizing the content. But pre-writing and brainstorming can look a lot different for each writer. So I, for instance, like to talk out my drafts with different people. So I will often say, hey, I have this idea, and then I'll just start talking. And for me, this is actually a way of brainstorming or pre-writing because I start sorting through my ideas in my head. I also take a lot of notes in books that I'm reading, or I keep little post-it notes, so as something occurs to me, I jot it down. I consider this all part of my pre-writing process, although it doesn't necessarily look like what you might do, which might be create a word map, or jot down notes in a notebook, or type stuff out, or even use a video record or a audio recording or a memo on your iPhone, for instance, to speak out some ideas. So what works for one person won't work for another. And so you want to think about what works for you in terms of helping you get ideas out, how to think about them, and how to help you figure out what it is you need to say and how to say it. And I encourage you to try some different strategies and reflect on how those strategies work for you. In fact, on your Digication portfolio, I will occasionally ask you to reflect on your drafting process, as well as reflect on how you feel everything went and what you might want to try for the next assignment. So a lot of this class will be an exploration in the strategies that work for you. The second stage of the writing process is drafting, and this is very much when you put pen to paper. It's not a lot, it's not very glamorous, but at the same time, you might find yourself drafting a little and then moving back to pre-writing, and this is where the process gets recursive. And in fact, some people, it looks like they're drafting, but they're actually pre-writing. So there's a couple of composition scholars who talk about what they call one draft and multi-draft writers. And a one-draft writer usually has done all their pre-writing so that when they sit down, they essentially can just run through the draft, write it all out, and it looks pretty solid, and then they go from there. But other writers have to write every single thing out and then go back and reassess and then start a new draft, and that's when they're able to move from pre-writing to drafting. So again, this is a very much a part of how you think and how you work. So you might actually be a multi-draft writer, and that's why your writing maybe doesn't work quite well, but if you revisit it, you're able to then move into the drafting phase more successfully, and on a second or a third draft, your writing starts to get much more polished. It works, it actually accomplishes its purpose. So again, I invite you to think about what kind of writer you are, how you work, and what kinds of approaches you can bring to this phase that will work best for you in order to produce successful and effective documents. The last stage of the process, and the one that I find to be the most important and would argue is the most important, is revision. Revision is that typical, like you print out the draft, you mark all over it, you start really assessing it for a lot of different things. I say it is the most essential stage for effective writing. It is where the magic of writing occurs. If you don't give yourself enough time to revise, you aren't able to assess a document for organization, for its formatting, for its visual appearance, or for the content. And here is where revision is really key. It allows you to step out from your writer brain and into a reader's brain. So a lot of times students find that they write something, they think it's pretty solid, then they put it away for a while, and then they come back to it, and then they start seeing some things that they want to change. Unfortunately, if you're one of those people who's convinced that last-minute writing is the way to go, you can't ever revise because you don't have time to let it breathe. So this idea that you're able to take a draft, put it in a drawer, lock it away for a day or two, and then revisit it with fresh eyes is part of what makes revision work. And then you're able to assess it not from how you're thinking about it as the writer. You're able to step outside of it and start looking at it as an audience member or a reader and assessing its effectiveness in different kinds of ways. So I will encourage you to get started early on your drafts. In fact, I will basically make you get started early on your drafts so that you're able to leave yourself enough time for revision. The other part of the revision stage is that it is often lumped in with editing or proofreading, but I want you to think about how it is very different from both editing and proofreading. So revision is assessing the big things, what are called global concerns in a document. Whereas editing and proofreading are looking at what are called local concerns, or the smaller or lower level stuff. So if you're revising, you might be rearranging your sections, you might be adding new content, you might be incorporating a new source, you might be really, doing big stuff to a document and majorly changing it. But if you're editing or proofreading, what you're often doing is looking at the word level. So editing would be going through and saying, is this the right word here? Does this make sense? Maybe I should replace this word with this word. Maybe I'll flop this sentence around a little bit, but essentially you're keeping the content the same. And proofreading is even more specific, and it's really just looking for the typos, making sure your commas are all in place, making sure nothing's misspelled. And those are important parts of the writing process, but they do come at the end, and they should be seen as distinct from revision, and you should leave yourself enough time to do both. So when I say revision, I don't mean just going through and fixing typos. I mean really looking at the effectiveness of the document and assessing it and adding more content or rearranging or whatever you need to do to make it more effective. And I learned this from an elementary school teacher, and I found it to be really useful. But revision is with the ears, whereas editing was with the eyes. So when I revise, I often will read my draft out loud, and I'll listen to it, so I can hear how it sounds. And when you're listening to it from that way, it is a lot more effective than just skimming over the words on the page, and it allows you to really hear if your message is getting across to the audience. So here are the takeaways. What I want you to think about as you proceed through this course for the rest of the semester is that you're going to be exploring. You're going to be experimenting. You're going to be trying things out. Because I find revision to be so essential to student success, this course is built heavily on that idea that you will be revising your documents. This is why 45% of your final grade is built on your final portfolio. And in that, you can really take a document that maybe wasn't quite as successful, you have an opportunity to revise it, and you can get a better score, because if your revised drafts look significantly better than what you turned in initially, your portfolio will score much higher. And so what I'm looking for there is an attention or an intent and a willingness to revisit your writing, revise, and keep tinkering. So I want you to explore what works for you. What is your process? If you think you're one of those last-minute writers, try not waiting until the last minute and see how that works for you. I often have students who say, oh, I should do more planning before I sit down and start writing. And so they start experimenting with strategies to pre-write, to get ideas out before they actually start drafting. And they find that that works pretty well for them. In addition, I want you to think about how you can more fully incorporate revision into your writing process. Again, often because we're in such a hurry, we don't give ourselves enough time to revise. And so you might glance at it before you turn it in, but you don't really get a chance to do a full-on revision. And this might mean giving yourself time to go to the Writing Center, to make an appointment to meet with me, or to do any of those things. And finally, remember the writing process is not one size fits all. What works for one person won't work for another. So I might make a suggestion to you, but it might not work for you, but you might find something else that works just as well for you. as the thing that I suggest works for me. So the stages can give you some useful general tools to write more effectively, but remember they're just stages. They're not hard and fast rules. They're not consistent for every single writer, but they are some general guidelines that you can follow to be a more effective communicator. And then this is the actual finally is revise, revise, revise. Just always be thinking about incorporating revision and all that you can do there. So that's the writing process. Hope that helps outline some of the ideas and themes that we'll continue exploring throughout the semester, and that it sets you up to be thinking about how you are as a writer.